My grandmother's hands were the first thing I always noticed about her. Rough and brown and always slightly cold even in summer. She had worked her whole life a seamstress for 40 years, then a home baker after her knees gave out. Then just a woman who sat in the corner chair and watched her family grow around her, the way a tree watches a garden it planted. Quiet, patient, always there. She died on a Tuesday in March. 81 years old. She went in her sleep the way everyone hopes to go, and when the hospice nurse called my mother made a sound I had never heard a human being make before. Something between a word and a collapse. I was in the kitchen making tea I would never drink, and I just stood there with the kettle in my hand until the water went cold. Her name was Dorothea. Everyone called her Dot. And I thought we all thought that we knew exactly who she was. We were wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before the Bible, before the letter, before the phone call that changed everything, there was the reading of the will. And that's where this story really starts. That's where the cracks first showed. Grandma Dot had 6 grandchildren. I'm the youngest, 24, at the time of her death. My cousins range from 27 to 38. We are not a close family in the way that families in movies are close. We don't vacation together or text in a group chat or show up for birthdays uninvited, but we loved her. Every single one of us loved her in our own fractured ways, and I thought that love would hold us together when she was gone. It did not hold us together. The will was read 3 days after the funeral. My grandmother's estate was, as I understood it, modest. A small house in a rural town, about 2 hours from the city, some savings, a few pieces of jewelry. Her car, which was 11 years old and had a broken passenger side mirror she'd never gotten around to fixing. Her attorney, a quiet man named Gerald who looked like he'd been practicing law since before any of us were born, read it in his office on a Thursday afternoon, all 6 of us crammed into chairs that didn't quite fit the room. She split everything evenly. The house to be sold proceeds divided 6 ways. The savings, around $42,000, divided 6 ways. The jewelry split among the 3 oldest female grandchildren, with a note that said she hoped we'd share it with our sisters. My cousin Derek, the oldest, sat with his arms crossed the entire time and kept doing the math on his phone under the table. I watched him and felt something uncomfortable crawl up the back of my neck. Afterward, in the parking lot, things got ugly quickly. Derek had decided, based on nothing, that because he'd done the most for Grandma Dot in her last years, he deserved a larger share. His sister Marcy agreed loudly and without evidence. My brother stood next to me and said very quietly, "This is why we don't do group chats," and I almost laughed, except none of it was funny. I drove home feeling hollowed out. Not because of the money. $7,000 is $7,000, and I wasn't going to turn it down, but because of what the day had felt like. Like we were picking over the bones of someone who deserved so much better than us. I want to tell you something about Derek, because I think it matters for what comes later, and because he is not simply a villain, even if he behaved like one. Derek is 48 years old, and he spent more time with my grandmother in her final years than any of the rest of us did. He drove her to doctor's appointments. He fixed her gutters one October in the rain. He called her every Sunday without fail, and I know this because she told me once with genuine warmth, "Derek always calls on Sunday." So I understood, at least in the abstract, where his bitterness was coming from. He had shown up. He had done the work. And the result felt to him the same as if he hadn't. What I couldn't understand was the way the grief had converted into calculations so fast. 2 days after we buried her, 2 days after we stood at the grave of a woman who loved all of us as completely as she could, and already we were running numbers under tables. My mother told me later that Derek had called her the night before the will reading, fishing for information about whether Grandma Dot had made any special provisions for him privately. My mother had told him she didn't know. He'd apparently been unsatisfied with that answer. I don't say any of this to excuse what I thought about for 2 days after finding the Bible. I already told you I considered staying quiet. I'm not better than Derek. I just made a different choice. I went back to her house that weekend to help with the cleaning. My mother had asked me to go through the bedroom, which nobody else wanted to do. The older cousins had already claimed the items they wanted. Derek had taken the TV of all things, and what was left was a bedroom that still smelled like her. Talcum powder and something floral and faint. I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before I started. Her nightstand had 3 drawers. The top one had her reading glasses, some cough drops, a water glass with a lipstick ring on the rim that I couldn't throw away for almost 5 minutes. The second drawer had a crossword book, a small flashlight, and a photograph I'd never seen before, a young woman holding a newborn looking at the camera with an expression I can only describe as completely wrecked. I didn't recognize the woman at first, then I looked longer. It was Grandma Dot, maybe 20 years old. And the baby in her arms was not any baby I had ever seen in our family albums. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in pencil so faded I had to tilt it toward the window, T, 6 days old. March? Just that. An initial, an age, a month. No year. No last name. I set it on the nightstand and sat with it for a while. My mind did the thing minds do when they brush against something that doesn't fit the shape of the story. They know it reached for smaller explanations. A neighbor's child she'd cared for. A cousin's baby. A photograph misfiled from someone else's life. I was grasping for anything simpler than what I was beginning to suspect. I thought about her face in that photograph. I've looked at a lot of photographs of people I love. I have never seen an expression quite like that one. She wasn't sad exactly, not exactly happy either. She looked like a person being asked to do something that was going to cost them something permanent, and she had already understood the full price. The camera had caught the exact moment of that understanding. I kept going. The third drawer was mostly empty, except for a Bible. Old black leather, the kind that gets soft over decades of handling. Her name was written inside the front cover in faded ink, Dorothea May Calloway, the name she'd had before she married my grandfather. I flipped through it slowly because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. That's when the envelope fell out. It was tucked between the pages of Psalms. Plain white envelope sealed with no name written on the outside, just a small cross drawn in blue pen in the upper corner. I held it for probably 30 seconds before I opened it. I'm still not sure if I should have. I'm still not sure it matters. Inside was a handwritten document, 3 pages long in my grandmother's handwriting, the looped careful cursive she used for birthday cards and letters, and the little notes she used to tuck into my coat pocket when I was small. It was a will. A second will. I read it twice before I understood what I was looking at. The document was dated 8 years prior. It named one beneficiary, a man called Thomas. No last name. Just Thomas, and the name of a small town in a state 300 miles away, a place called Harlan County. It left him specifically a savings account at a bank I had never heard of, with a balance last recorded at $340,000. $340,000. I sat on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom and read it a third time. Then I found the letter folded underneath it. If you enjoy real drama stories like this, consider subscribing. There's a lot more where this came from. The letter was addressed to Thomas. It was 8 pages long. I know I shouldn't have read it. I know that. But I read every single word sitting on that floor, with the afternoon light going gold through the curtains and the house quiet around me like it was holding its breath. I'm not going to share everything she wrote. Some of it is too private, too specific, too entirely hers. But I can tell you this: she had a son. Before my grandfather. Before the family we all knew. She was 19 years old, and she had a son, and she was told by her mother, by the Times, by everyone, and everything around her, that she could not keep him. She named him Thomas. She held him for 4 hours. Then he was taken, and for the rest of her life she carried him like a stone in her chest. In the letter she described the day she gave him up in more detail than I expected. She wrote about the hospital, the nurse who carried him out of the room, the sound the door made when it closed. She wrote that she had counted the ceiling tiles because she needed something to look at that wasn't moving and wasn't leaving. 23 tiles. A water stain in the shape of something she couldn't identify. She had memorized those tiles in the way you memorize things when your mind is trying to store something it knows it cannot hold any other way. She wrote that she did not tell my grandfather about Thomas when they married, not because she didn't trust him, but because she had been so thoroughly taught to understand that silence as the correct and only response. That what had happened was a mistake, and mistakes were for burying, and she had buried it. She wrote that she thought about him on his birthday every year, March. She wrote that she lit a candle at church each year on that date, and said a prayer for a boy she didn't know who was somewhere being raised by people she would never meet. Then she found him. She was 51. She described how it happened: careful, methodical research over years, letters to agencies, a contact through a church network, small pieces of information assembled over time. She described the first moment she learned his name, his full name, the one his adoptive family had given him, and wrote that she'd had to sit down on the kitchen floor and breathe for a while because hearing a name for him after 32 years of only having an initial felt like something her body wasn't prepared for. She found him when he was 32. He had no idea she existed. She didn't reach out. She was terrified he would hate her, terrified that appearing in his life would only cause damage, but she found out where he was. She learned he'd had a good childhood, a family who loved him, a trade, a quiet life in a small town. And she made a decision. She would take care of him without him knowing. For 30 years, she sent money to an intermediary, a lawyer she'd hired specifically for this purpose, who passed it along to Thomas under the fiction that it was from an anonymous charitable fund for people in his county who faced medical hardship. Because Thomas had medical hardship, he had a degenerative condition diagnosed in his 40s that had, by the time I found that letter, progressed significantly. She watched from a distance for 3 decades. She sent him money, she earned herself secretly, never telling my grandfather, never telling her children. She maintained a separate savings account in her maiden name. She wrote him letters she never sent, storing them in a box beneath the floorboard of her bedroom closet, a box I found 40 minutes after I found the Bible, my hands shaking the whole time. The hidden will existed because she had recently changed her mind. About the distance. About the silence. She was 80 and she knew she was dying, and she had decided finally that Thomas deserved to know the truth, that he deserved to know where the money had come from, that he deserved at the very least a letter. The will and the letter were her plan. She had arranged for Gerald, the same attorney who'd read us the official will, to receive a sealed package upon her death. The package contained everything: the identity of Thomas, the history, the money, the letter she had finally written for him. But Gerald had never received a package, because my grandmother had not sent it yet. She died before she could send it. I don't know how long I sat on that floor. Long enough that my legs went numb. Long enough that the light in the room changed from gold to gray. I had a choice to make. I want to be honest about this part. I thought about not saying anything. I thought about it for about 2 days, and I'm not proud of that. $340,000 divided among 6 grandchildren is a very different number than $7,000. I knew what my cousins would say. I could already hear Derek's voice in my head making legal arguments, talking about what was and wasn't official, talking about what could be contested. But I kept coming back to the photograph in the nightstand. A young woman holding a newborn. An expression that was completely, irreversibly wrecked. I kept coming back to 8 pages of a letter that had been written and rewritten and carried for years, addressed to a man who didn't know his mother, had never stopped thinking about him. I made some calls. It took me 2 weeks to find him. The town she'd named in the will was real. Thomas was a real person, 59 years old, semi-retired, a former electrician. He'd never married, he lived alone. His medical situation was serious. He had been managing it for years, and the last update my grandmother's lawyer had on file was not encouraging. I called the attorney first. Not Gerald, the other one, the intermediary my grandmother had used. He was surprised to hear from me, but not, I realized, entirely surprised. He had been waiting for some kind of contact for a while. He confirmed everything the letter had said, and he told me that Thomas had no idea. That as far as Thomas knew, the money he'd been receiving was from a county charitable program. He had written a letter of gratitude to the program once years ago, and it had been passed along to my grandmother. She had kept it. I found it in the box under the floorboards. A handwritten letter from a man who didn't know who he was thanking. My grandmother had read that letter so many times the paper was worn thin at the folds. What would you have done? I keep asking myself this even now. I genuinely don't know if I made the right choices, or just the choices I could live with. But I want you to understand why I did what I did next. I told my mother first. That was the worst conversation of my life. Not because my mother reacted badly, she didn't, not at first. She sat very still, and she listened to everything I said, and then she didn't speak for almost a full minute. When she finally did, her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. She said, "She never told any of us." Not as an accusation, as a fact she was trying to absorb. Then she asked to see the letter. I let her read it. She cried in the way that people cry when they are grieving two things at once: the person they lost and the person they thought they knew. We agreed to tell the rest of the family together in one meeting. That meeting was a disaster. Derek lost his mind. That's the only honest way to say it. He went from zero to legal threat in about 6 minutes, calling the second will invalid, calling the whole thing suspect, actually suggesting out loud that the document might be forged. His wife nodded along beside him the whole time, and his sister Marcy started crying, and my brother sat next to me with his jaw tight and didn't say a word. I kept my voice calm. I showed them what I had. I showed them the letters, the photograph, the documentation from the attorney. I made it very clear that I had already spoken to a legal professional, and that the account was in my grandmother's maiden name, and was entirely separate from the estate they had already agreed to divide. Derek said the word lawyer 4 times in one sentence. At one point he stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to us for about 30 seconds. I watched him. I could see his shoulders move as he breathed. Then he turned around and said, "She was being taken advantage of. Someone convinced her to do this. We need to look into who that attorney was." I told him I had his full name and license number if he wanted to make a complaint to the Bar Association. He did not look grateful for that information. His wife said, "None of us even know if this person is who he says he is. There's no last name in the will. For all we know, his identity has been verified by the attorney she employed for 30 years, I said. He has documentation. His birth records are consistent with what she wrote in the letter. This is not a scam. This is your grandmother's firstborn son." Marcy started crying harder. I noticed she wasn't crying the way you cry when you're grieving. She was crying the way you cry when you're losing an argument, and crying might help. I felt tired in a way that went down to my bones. I told him that was his right, and that I was not under any circumstances doing anything to stop Thomas from receiving what his mother had set aside for him over 30 years. That was when things got very quiet. My cousin Marcy said, "But we don't even know if he's really," and I cut her off. I told her that Gerald had already been contacted, that the process of notifying Thomas was already in motion, that the only question left was whether our family would handle this with some kind of dignity, or whether we would spend the next year fighting over a man our grandmother loved before any of us were born. Nobody spoke for a while. My mother, who had been silent through most of this, looked at Derek and said very quietly, "Dot worked every day of her life. That was her money. You are not going to contest it." And then she picked up her purse and walked out of the room. I have never loved my mother more than I did in that moment. If these kinds of stories resonate with you, a like really helps the channel. It means everything. Thomas was notified on a Friday. I know because Gerald called me that evening, not because he was supposed to, but because I think he felt I deserved to know. He told me that Thomas had received the letter and the documentation, and that he had been very quiet on the phone. That he'd asked Gerald to repeat certain parts. That when Gerald finished, Thomas had said he needed some time and he would call back. He called back 2 hours later. He asked only one question. Was she happy? Gerald told him he believed she was. That she had a family who loved her. That she had lived a full life. That she had thought about him every single day, which the letters made clear beyond any doubt. Thomas said thank you and hung up. I got that information secondhand. I replayed it about 100 times. I thought about what it must have been like to answer that phone call. To hear at 59 years old that the question you may or may not have spent decades trying not to ask had an answer. To find out that the charitable program that had helped you through the worst of your medical struggles for 30 years was not a program at all. It was your mother. It was the same woman who had counted 23 ceiling tiles in a hospital room because she needed something to look at that wasn't leaving. I wonder sometimes if he cried. I wonder if he was alone. I hope he was not completely alone. A few weeks later, I made a decision that I had not told anyone I was considering. I wrote Thomas a letter. Not on behalf of the family they didn't know, just from me. I told him who I was. I told him I had been the one to find the Bible, the will, the letters. I told him a little bit about who our grandmother was, about her hands cold even in summer, about her birthday card cursive, about the corner chair she sat in while the family grew around her. I told him she had kept his letter of gratitude worn thin at the folds. I didn't know if he would write back. I wasn't sure he should. I just thought he deserved to know something real about her beyond what a document could say. He wrote back. It took about 3 weeks. His letter was short. He said he had no memory of her, of course, that he had always known he was adopted, that he had made peace with it long ago, in the way you make peace with things when you have no other choice. He said the money had made an enormous difference in his treatment over the years, that there had been times when he genuinely didn't know how he would manage, and then a disbursement would come and he would manage. He had always been quietly grateful to whatever program had helped him. He said it was strange and overwhelming to find out it had been a person. One specific person. His mother. He said he wished he had known. But he also said, and this is the part I've thought about the most, that knowing now was not nothing, that a letter arriving after someone is gone still carries weight. That it is not the same as having them, but it is not nothing. He said he was glad I wrote. I wrote back once more. He wrote back once more. In that second letter, he mentioned that he had asked his doctor to pull up his records from the last 30 years, to look at every disbursement from the fund, to try to calculate how much had come through over time. He said the total confirmed more than the number in the will. She had been sending money before the formal account was established, smaller amounts going back further than she'd described. He said his doctor was confused by his interest in old billing records. He said he didn't know how to explain it. He said he had put the letter she'd written him in the same drawer as his medical records, because that was the drawer he opened most often, and he wanted to see it often. After that, we haven't been in contact, and I think that's probably right. There is only so much that can be crossed in letters between strangers who share half a bloodline and nothing else. But I know he's out there. I know he knows, and I know that in her own silent, impossible way she made sure he'd be okay. Derek did consult a lawyer. The lawyer apparently told him what I'd already told him. The account was in her maiden name, established independently with documentation going back decades. The will was dated, witnessed, and legally sound. There was nothing to contest. Derek hasn't spoken to me since. I'm told by mutual relatives that he's decided I'm the villain of this story, which I find genuinely fascinating. My mother framed the photograph from the nightstand. The young woman holding the newborn. She keeps it in her hallway, now next to a photo of Grandma Dot at 80, sitting in her corner chair, soft and patient, watching everything. I look at both photographs sometimes and I try to imagine what it cost her. Not the money, that's the least interesting part. I mean what it cost her to carry something that heavy, for that long, to never speak it out loud, to reach across 60 years with nothing but careful silence, and an envelope and a name. I don't have an answer. I just know that she did it. That it was the most important thing she ever did, and none of us knew. I found her Bible on a Saturday afternoon in March in a house that still smelled like talcum powder and something floral and faint. I sat on the floor until my legs went numb. And I think about Thomas in his small town, 300 miles away, reading a letter from a woman he never knew, understanding finally why things always somehow worked out, why help came when he needed it. Why he was never, despite everything, alone. She had a name for him before anyone gave him another one. She kept it her whole life. She kept him her whole life. That's the story of my grandmother Dot. The woman in the corner chair watching the garden she planted. I thought I knew her. I didn't. But I'm glad I found out.